Hello everyone, it's Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore here, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. So this is my regular Thursday stream that I do, where we talk about actually making music. Wednesday we have the cafe talking about using MuseScore. Today we talk about making music, and often we look at some of your compositions and arrangements. Today I kind of have my own thing that I want to be doing here, and there's not that much music that's been submitted lately anyhow. So welcome everyone, and thanks everyone checking in. And I am going to just check the chat and make sure things are fine, and they are fine. So yeah, the video and audio thing that I was struggling with yesterday. So if you didn't get the memo already, I am going to do a special stream tomorrow, my usual stream time, this same time right now, tomorrow on Friday. But it's not going to be on YouTube. It's going to be in the community. So if you haven't already gone to the community, let me put that link in there in the chat here. But it's the same as the school link, which is linked at the top, but then you just click where it says community. But I'm just going to put the link directly. So if you haven't already activated your membership there, it's okay. Now I'm talking and typing at the same time, and apparently I can't do that. MasteringMuseScore.com, community.masteringmusescore.com. So if you haven't already activated there, if you're already a student in one of my classes, then it's just really automatic. Just click the login button and then continue with Mastering MuseScore. If you haven't already signed up for any of my classes, you still do that same thing. It'll just ask you to create an account, but it's free. So you'll have to be a member of the community to be viewing the video. And heads up, we are eventually going to be moving the masterclass over to that format because it's going to be a really cool format. And really excited to be debuting it tomorrow, this new format that it's going to be in, and then eventually move the masterclass over to it. So what I want to do here is, I've been talking about use of modes, and in particular talking about, the original modes. There's, the Greek modes as they existed. There were the Middle Ages modes, and then there was the modes that sort of got codified by like the 1600s or so, which were different still. And then there's our current names for them, which are different still. So lots of different aspects of what these traditional modes were, but they all frankly had to do with just the white keys on the piano, different ways of seeing it, right? C to C is Ionian, D to D is Dorian, and then we also can then take that same pattern of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step. We can take that same pattern and start anywhere, right? So if we want G Dorian, we'll do the same thing. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step. The pattern of whole steps and half steps is what defines the modes. So I usually think of them in terms of major scales and what you need to alter. So Dorian is major scale, but flat the third, flat the seventh. So if I take a G major scale and I flat the third and flat the seventh, I get Dorian. So that's a quick review of what I've been talking about the last couple weeks. Oh, great, Sam! I'm looking forward to checking out your modal piece. And if you've posted it already, I'll try to see if I can take a look today. But what I want to actually talk about today, though, is I want to focus on a way of how would I put it? A definition of the word mode that applies to something other than just those sets of things. These 7 modes that we get. C to C is Ionian, D to D is Dorian, E to E is Phrygian, F to F is Lydian, G to G is Mixolydian, A to A is Aeolian, B to B is Locrian. As I said, that was not a thing in the Renaissance or earlier. It was really just invented to complete the series relatively late in the game. Like, I think it might have even been after 1600. So anyhow, those 7 modes, and then the Renaissance people had all these different ways of looking at it. Well, like, what if you have the notes from A to A as your range of notes, but you actually end on D? That's different than D to D ending on D, and they give them different names, Hypodorian and all this other stuff. So All that aside, I'm talking today about something different still. So I'm going to use a terminology that's a colloquialism. It is not a good way historically of using the word mode, but it's a colloquial way of using it, and it's a way used by most jazz and rock musicians. And we're using the word mode in the same way that we might use it in English, where we talk about, oh, there's different modes of operation for this thing. Different mode meaning a manner of doing something. There's this mode and that mode. So I'm going to use the word mode by talking about the modes of the major scale. We're going to invent this historical fantasy that says the major scale has always been very important. It wasn't. Aeolian and Dorian, those were the important modes. But in modern thinking, the major scale is the one we think of as the most important. So we can call these other things that historically were just called modes. This colloquial way of looking at it is we call them modes of the major scale. In other words, if I take the C major scale and start it on a different pitch, I get other modes of that scale. Historically, not the right way to think about it, but the way that I'm gonna use going forward here a little bit today. So if I take another scale, like say F, then I can talk about that F major scale and G Dorian as being a mode of the F scale. So what I want to do now is take that use of the word mode and apply it to something other than the major scale. I'm going to apply it to the melodic minor scale. So I'm going to take a melodic minor scale, and I'll go ahead and do it I'll just do it on C. Melodic minor, right? It's got a flatted third, and on the way up, it's just like major. Now, if you learn melodic minor from someone who wanted you to practice it as an exercise, they probably told you to play it this way up and play it this way down. I'm going to tell you that's a very artificial thing to do. Yes, it's the way we traditionally played that scale, but music isn't scales. Music is music. And this thing that says sometimes we play A naturals and B naturals, sometimes we play A flats and B flats, that's absolutely true. It's a bad overgeneralization to say that we actually play A's and B's on the way up and A flats and B flats on the way down, or if we don't do that, it's not melodic minor. These are all just words, schmerds. I care about the music. So in any case, I'm going to be talking about this set of notes and calling it melodic minor. And the reason, and it's not going to matter whether I'm going up or down, because in point of fact, I might be improvising. I'm just improvising melodies using that. It's a bag of notes we sometimes talk about, a pitch collection, a set of notes you can use when improvising. So if you're going to improvise with the melodic minor scale, you're going to use that same notes whether your melody happens to be going up or melody happens to be going down. So what I want to talk about a little bit today, because it's one of the reasons this whole mode thing came up, has to do with a very important thing that jazz musicians discovered, and I use that term plural. Really, it's the work of one man, George Russell, who I've alluded to before, but now I'm going to be going a little deeper into talking about George Russell. So George Russell had the foresight to realize that you could use the modes of that melodic minor scale, D to D, E flat to E flat, F to F, G to G, A to A, and B to B. That same set of notes that defines melodic minor, but starting it in different place. So piano is distorting. Let me turn down my microphone volume. See if this is any better. There is a buzz. What would I say here? Oh, actually, hold on. Wait a second. It might be that I'm not even using my microphone. It might be that I've got the microphone plugged in, but Oh God, webcam microphone. No, 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 no. No, no, no. I went to the trouble of plugging in the external microphone. Okay, so now, is that any better? Hopefully that's a little better. If not, let me know and I'll keep playing with the volume. But that's at least the right microphone. I set up the microphone, but sometimes it gets recognized and sometimes it thinks my webcam microphone is what I want to use. So thanks for letting me know, and let me know if that improved things any. Hopefully it did. Okay, so what I want to do is use those sets of notes, but talk about how we're going to use them. So George Russell set up, he has this book called the Lydian Chromatic Approach to Tonal Organization. Oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the book. It's got a big, long, fancy sounding title. Sounds like a research paper. It's got the word Lydian in it. And it's a book that's, I guess it's in print, but sometimes it goes out of print periodically. And anyhow, it's you can definitely find it. I should just do a quick search for it and let you know for sure. Someone else let me know the name of the thing. You can look it up. George Russell, Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organization for Jazz Improvisation. I don't know if that's what it's called, something like that. So the idea that he had is, instead of doing what musicians had typically done, which is think about the key a song is in and improvise by using the notes of that key, he came up with this idea that we could treat each chord individually and optimize a scale for each chord. And it was a very revolutionary way of doing things. Now it's quite taken for granted. Most jazz musicians are at least somewhat familiar with this and have used these sounds at least some. But, you know, depending on where you're coming from, either this is your main way of thinking or it's just something you were barely exposed to and don't really deal with. Tonal Organization. Okay, yep, I had the right title. It just doesn't say Jazz Improvisation on it. So great. Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organization. Thank you. I want to show a little bit about how this works. I did a demonstration of this during office hours for those of you who participated in that on Tuesday, but now I want to go into a little bit more about this because I want to show you how you can use this. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to enter some chord symbols here, and it's just going to be D minor 7, G7, C major 7. Just going to be that. Those, I don't need my palette. There we go. Just those chords over and over again. Let's make them bigger, shall we? Okay. So if we were just doing a normal jazz improvisation way of dealing with this, the way people might have been doing it in 1910 or so. Oh, by the way, before I even do this, I need to point out that although I'm presenting this in the context of jazz improvisation, it is by no means specific to jazz improvisation. Everything I'm going to talk about, you can apply in a composition or an arrangement. Chord voicings, all the selection of these notes, I'm showing it in the context of improvisation, but we can absolutely use these concepts anywhere we want. So what I'm going to do is show it in the context of improvisation, because that's kind of where these concepts kind of were first introduced. If I was going to do this the really traditional old school way of improvising, I just know that this chord progression is 2-5-1 in the key of C, and I just improvise in the key of C. So I'm just improvising fairly mindlessly. I guess I'm making some effort to make it a reasonably okay melody, but mostly I'm just noodling. I could totally noodle and play random nonsense, right? And I'm not trying, right? The point is, if you stay in the key of C, to some extent, any melody note works. So in jazz improvisation, we do this all the time. And if you think about it, this applies. I mean, even if you think about like, oh, all the voice leading rules that you learn, as long as you're mostly playing steps, you can play any note because the next note's going to be a step away. All the classical voice leading rules are all about introducing non-chord tones, then resolving them by step. So if I play this whole set of notes, non-chord tone, resolving to chord tone, non-chord tone, resolving to chord tone, non-chord tone, resolving to chord tone, non-chord tone, resolving to chord tone is a seventh chord tone. Sort of yes, sort of no, but in any case, it then resolves to chord tone. And the same thing on the way down. So as long as you're playing something that's basically scalar, you're not breaking any rules. You know, you're writing melodies that Bach could have written. And that's why when I did that one thing before, remember when I sent out Bird or Bach, and pointed out how similar their lines actually were? Well, yeah, if you're mostly playing scales, then your non-chord tones are resolving by step. And when you're not playing a scale, if you arpeggiate the chord, well then so much the better. So that's like the next level of melodic making, melody making, is we play something that's basically scalar, but we also maybe arpeggiate the chord. And then over the G7, I'm playing something scalar, and then I arpeggiate the chord, right? That kind of thinking that's the basis of melody making, whether you're Bach or whether you're Charlie Parker. So you play things that are scalar, you arpeggiate the chord. If you're Charlie Parker, maybe you arpeggiate up to a ninth or a flat nine. But Bach did that too. Bach really did that too. So as did Beethoven. So that idea that we're basically playing lines that are scalar, we're arpeggiating occasionally, and when we arpeggiate, we're arpeggiating chord tones maybe as far as the ninth. That's all common to all music. And so far, we haven't gotten to what George Russell is introducing here. Before I do that, I have to introduce one other thing that is more of a jazz thing than a classical thing. But again, you will find examples of it in classical music. And that's the idea of chromatic passing tones. So for instance, if I'm playing melodies using the keys of C, and then I want to reach, I know that maybe I want to land on a chord tone for the G7, I want to land on the B. I'll do it in this octave so it sounds a little better. Maybe if I'm not ready to get to the B yet, you know, if I'm playing 1 and 2, I want to take 4 notes to get from the G to the B, if that's what my melody happens to be doing. Well, you can throw in a passing tone, a chromatic passing tone. Or, right, you can throw in these chromatic passing tones to make your melody still be going by steps, but land on the note you want to land on. This is a tried and true thing that you will see going back to classical music, and you'll definitely see in jazz. And it doesn't require any of this fancy George Russell stuff. These passing tones that I'm adding in are just there to get me to the chord tone. So finally, after all that setup, I want to look at applying one of George Russell's scales. So what I just did was just throw in a little passing tone. And again, maybe I put in a passing tone while I'm playing. A little chromatic passing tone. A little chromatic passing tone on the way down, right? I'm putting in these chromatic passing tones just to get me places. So what Russell did is say, hey, let's not just only do that. That's a fine language, nothing wrong with it. It's been around for hundreds of years, works great. But what if we looked at that G7 chord and said, you know what are really some great notes that we don't have to only treat as passing tones, but we can really embrace a little bit more as color tones and really enjoy the sound of that note over the chord, not just a way of getting to another note, but really appreciate that note over that chord. So all those modes of the melodic minor that I talked about, they all apply here. So what I'm going to do right now is over G7, I'm going to use the scale that I talked about in my newsletter, which is Lydian Dominant, right? It's the major scale, G major, but sharp 11, flat 7. So that's G Lydian Dominant. And that kind of line became popular around that time. Now, people had discovered that note, that sharp 11, before George Russell. I think that's the note that got him thinking. I wonder if there's other notes like that that we could play with. So that sound of G7, but using just that one note, that sharp 11, C sharp or sharp 4, because everything else here is in the key. Everything else is just white notes. So that one note just adds this very jazz-specific color. And there's a very famous saying, I think it was Eddie Condon who said this, when, an old traditional, he wasn't that old at the time, but he was a more traditionalist compared to the modernists like Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker hit on that idea of sharping that 11, as did others. I think they got it from Thelonious Monk, just to give you a little history on it. But Eddie Condon was like, and instead of calling it sharp 11, they called it flat 5, because it's really the same thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flat the 5. That kind of melody became really big in the 1940s, and Eddie Condon said, those beboppers, they like to flat their fifth. We drink ours, meaning like a fifth of whiskey. Anyhow, that was his point. He didn't care much for that flatted fifth sound, and that sort of started this sort of schism between traditional jazz and modern jazz. And really at this point, anything World War II era on is generally considered modern jazz, because that's where this split started happening, when people started exploring these color tones like that sharp 11. So that one there, the sharp 11, yeah, that was totally there pre-Russell, as was this arpeggiating up to the flat 9. Charlie Parker was all about that. But this is also hundreds of years old, because that A flat doesn't come from C major, but it does come from C minor, right? So it's a note that we borrow from the parallel minor key, and that's been around for hundreds of years. Again, you can find Bach doing it, you can definitely find Beethoven doing it. So just using that flat 9 in that particular context there was also common. So again, Russell knew that. Russell knew about that sharp 11, said, what other scales we got? So that Lydian Dominant scale is pretty cool, but the one that really blew people's minds and kind of set this whole new thing into motion, that wasn't just because Charlie Parker used that sharp 11, Charlie Parker used the flat 9. The scale that Charlie Parker did not use, because he didn't know about it, and I think he died. Well, he died, I think, just after the publication of that book. It was right around the same time. So what book did it in 53? Parker died in 55, 54, 52. I should remember. I don't. But in any case, he didn't get to be influenced it. But Dizzy Gillespie, who was Charlie Parker's playing companion for many years, Dizzy Gillespie, actually worked with George Russell, or vice versa. George Russell played in Dizzy's band, and so Dizzy definitely got introduced to these concepts. So, of all those modes of melodic minor that I just talked about, that Lydian Dominant is one of them. if I start on F, if I play the notes of C melodic minor but start on F, there's that sharp 4, flat 7, right? Compared to F major, this scale has a sharp 4 and a flat 7. So that's Lydian Dominant if you take melodic minor but start on the 4th note. If you take melodic minor and start here on the 7th note, check out what happens. It's a half step, and then a whole step, and then a half step, and then a whole step, and then whole steps the rest of the way. You got that? It's half whole steps the rest of the way. I want to do that on G7 now. I'm actually just going to play it like this. I'm going to start with G and go half step, whole step, half step, whole step, and then whole steps the rest of the way. And then eventually you resolve it. That set of notes, people's brains exploded when they were introduced to that. The idea that you could take the melodic minor scale, because that is, remember that I showed that pattern by looking at the melodic minor starting on the 7th note. So this is actually A flat melodic minor that I was just playing. That set of notes is A flat melodic minor, but starting on G. So that pattern, half whole, and then whole steps the rest of the way, is sometimes called the altered scale. And Russell had his own naming scheme, which we don't really use anymore. We now use a different naming scheme than his, because his was kind of complicated, and it involved having, the book comes with a little slide rule that you pull out to calculate which scale goes with which chord, and it's quite complicated actually. So people were turned off by how complicated it was. And I think they were turned off by early attempts to use his system. Because it was so complicated, people struggled to make interesting melodies with it. But as people found ways of making the system easier to comprehend and work with, people started coming up with better melodies. And I feel like that's a fine little melody there, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's a jazz melody in terms of the phrasing and the rhythms and the things that I'm doing with it. But as far as a set of notes to use over G7, it sounds pretty good. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to play that 2-5-1 chord progression, and I'm going to use that altered scale when I get there. In fact, I'm going to write out the notes so you can actually see what they are. It's over the D, G, A, B, C, D. Over the G, it's G, A flat, B flat, B, D flat, E flat, F, G, and then I'll talk about the C in a second. So notice what I did here. We tell a little lie when we spell this scale. Yes, in A flat melodic minor, it would be A flat, B flat, C flat. We would want to call that C flat if we were really dealing with A flat melodic minor, but we're not. We're dealing with G7, and I want to call that a B, right? Doesn't that make sense? So yes, this looks really weird when you write it out this way. We don't typically write out the whole scale, and sometimes we'll respell these notes as C sharp and D sharp if that helps the line, look better. We play games with this stuff, and yeah, it's cheating. It's not correct notationally, but it makes it more readable. And a lot of the other scales we use, like there's a scale that's very similar, but it's got 8 notes in it. There's no way to spell an 8 note instead of 7, right? This looks like 8 notes, but that's only because the G got repeated at the beginning and the end. The octatonic scale has 8 different notes, 9 if you include the repeated note at the top. So there's no way to spell that without repeating a letter name somewhere. So anyhow, I'm going to play this thing now, and I'm just going to use the major scale here. I'm going to use those notes. In fact, I'll just play those notes first. And I think part of how people part of how people came to dislike this sound was hearing people practice that, because that's just scales, right? That doesn't sound like music. And people got it into their head that, oh, George Russell wants you to play scales. No, he didn't want you to play scales. Wait a minute, is Russell still alive? He was until recently. I cannot remember if George Russell, in fact, I just want to look up something about George Russell for a moment here, just to remind myself. He either is still alive or died quite recently. And I spelled his name wrong, but Google will fix it. Oh my God, there's like some other random George Russell that comes up when you search on his name. So George Russell Jazz maybe will be better. George Russell died 2009. Wow, that long ago? Man, I am so off with time. But in any case, yeah, I remembered it being being just a couple years ago, but yeah, I swear I can barely remember anything. So anyhow, that's George Russell there. So yeah, George didn't want you playing scales. He wanted you making melody using those scales. So now I'm going to do that. So you can use those notes to make melodies. Now the other thing, so then George Russell went on to, it wasn't just that one scale that blew minds. He had a set of 6 scales, one of which was melodic minor, one of which was major, except he rethought about this, and then talked about all the modes of that scale and how you could use the different modes of that scale. Again, he had a different way of presenting it. He, instead of doing that, he would actually say, instead of saying, I'm going to use this scale starting on G, he didn't even use melodic minor. He used the one starting on the 3rd degree and said, this is the scale to use. B, that was the scale that he considered to be the, if I'm doing this right, and it's so hard for me to think about this stuff. I think that's the right one. Anyhow, I'm having to do math on a system that I didn't totally learn, but so he would say, oh, when you encounter G7, use B Lydian Augmented is the name of that scale, the 3rd mode of melodic minor. So it's all these different ways we have of looking at it. The simplest way that we use now is we just learn how to create the scale. I don't want to have to learn what other scale has the same notes as the one I want. I just want to learn the scale I want. So that pattern, half whole, whole the rest of the way, is just one you learn. Half whole, and then whole. When I mentioned an octatonic scale, an 8-note scale, it's half and whole alternating. And that's another one of the scales Russell talked about. Half whole, half whole, half whole, half whole. So that's another scale that Russell said you could use. And there was a total of 6 parent scales and then their modes. And then he had a whole system for choosing which parent scale goes with which chord, and then in this whole system involved there. So the other thing that Russell would have you do then is say, well, let's not use major on that major chord there. Because that F, everyone who plays jazz learns that F is dissonant against the E. It's not that we never play it, but if we do, it's a passing tone. It's a way up to G or a way down to C. What Russell did, and what really the starting point for this and why it's called the Lydian chromatic is, he said, let's use F sharp. Let's use the Lydian scale as the basis for everything. When we see a major chord, let's not think about major scale. Let's think about Lydian. That sharp 4 I mentioned that Charlie Parker used, that became the jumping off point for Russell. And actually he devotes like the last chapter, or maybe it's even an appendix, to talking about where this all comes from and talking about tetrachords. So looking at, yeah. Anyhow, if you read the book, you'll see how he derives all this from basically Greek. He goes back to ancient Greece and talks about the tetrachords that make up the 4-note patterns. That these patterns, these 4-note patterns within the scale, are really nice because that leads to G and that leads to C, and those are both chord tones in C major. So these tetrachords help emphasize the key, whereas major emphasizes the C, but then it has this half step going in F, and that's pretty awkward, and that's what he didn't like. He didn't like that half step. No one likes that half step going in F. I mean, we like the half step, but we don't like it over a C chord because it pulls you to F. But if you use F sharp, now the F sharp pulls you into G, which is where you want to be. G is a chord tone. It's where we want to get to. So this set of notes is what Russell would have you improvise with as your first choice. Oops. So that kind of sound started with Russell, basically. And by the way, so Oscar announcements made the other day, and West Side Story got some, Steven Spielberg's remake of West Side Story, but there's the... So, this is a C major chord with a really prominent F sharp in it. That's like one of the most famous examples of the Lydian scale there is. If you're looking for another example of that, the Simpsons theme song also has that very prominent Lydian sound. So that's another prominent Lydian bit of popular music culture. So this type of thinking where you use these different scales for each chord. I'm going to use this scale on this chord, and I'm going to use this scale on that chord. And those aren't your only other choices. Like I mentioned that that Russell also talks about Lydian Augmented, and that's another choice that he would say you could use. You might not play the G in your chord voicing if you're going to use it melodically, but let's check that out. So now we're getting a little more exotic, right? It's called Lydian Augmented because it does have an augmented triad in it. But it is just a mode of a melodic minor. So in any case, Russell has this whole system of scales that go with chords. And so then you learn to improvise by learning which are your scale choices. So over C major 7, your choices are major, although he didn't really care for that one. Lydian, that was his favorite. Lydian Augmented. And then a couple more that are more exotic still. This kind of, I think that's one of them. So this approach of saying we can really take each chord and then look at different scale possibilities. So Sora, Phrygian, is one of his choices. To make a Phrygian on D minor, you'd make this E flat and B flat. It's very dark. Yeah, it's very dark. I don't care for that sound in that context. To me, the Phrygian scale makes sense in other contexts, but it's one of your choices. But another one is the so-called Phrygian sharp 6. This is a mode of C melodic minor. It's C melodic minor, but starting on E flat. Compared to regular Phrygian, which would have had a B flat, Phrygian sharp 6 has that B natural, the 6th degree raised. So this scale is a little less dark because it has the B natural, but that E flat is still pretty darn dark. So quite a lot more exotic now, but it's a very controlled way of introducing all of this chromaticism. So learning these scales well enough to be able to pull these out while you're improvising and make melody. I mean, it's hard enough just to make good melodies, even if you're just sticking with the major scale, but the more of these scales you have to learn and keep in your head, this is part of what we practice when we practice improvising. I mean, if you think about it, you can't really practice improvising, because practicing really implies that you do something, you do it again, you do it again, and do it again. But with improvising, the moment you do it again, it's not improvised anymore. It's doing the same thing again. So yes, you can practice just improvising and then improvising something different and then improvising something different. But the question is, well, then where does the learning come from? The learning comes from doing what I'm doing here, of really convincing yourself that you know where these notes are and how to find those notes to make melodies with. Because I just did that in C, but now if I had to do that in A flat, I'm going to have to think. A flat. And then E flat 7. I'm having to think to do this. If I couldn't just improvise a melody that sounded good there, I'd have wrong notes all over the place. But if okay. See, that kind of sound, that's that nice part of the Phrygian scale. And then so I'm having to think a little bit here, okay, which are the notes of that scale? But by practicing that progression over and over again, I'll get as comfortable with E flat. So altered is the name of this scale, or chromatic whole tone. Diminished whole tone. It's called diminished whole tone because it starts off like a diminished scale, which is that octatonic scale, half whole, and then it ends like a whole tone scale, whole, whole, whole. So, I want to get that into my brain in the key that I'm actually improvising in. So the more often I go around that progression, the better cemented that scale is for me, and then the more comfortable I will be improvising melodies over it. So yeah, tetrachords are actually where all of our scales came from. Before they realized that you could put 7 notes in a row and make up an octave, they realized you could just make a few whole steps and half steps. And now let's stop there and think, what are we going to do with those? So the ancient Greek system of scales was built on tetrachords, and then the original modes, the original version of the medieval modes was built on these tetrachords as well. So yeah, and you're right, Deem, to observe that there's something about this that is bitonal sounding, because what's happening is we are actually coming from 3 different keys here. I mean, really, this, that, and this is, yeah, I'm now realizing that if I want to feel like Phrygian works for me over the D minor 7, I really want that E flat to come back to D and just center around D like that, and then I've got some nice little melodies. That's coming from C melodic minor, and then this is coming from A flat melodic minor. So it's like I'm putting C minor on top of D minor for the first chord, and then it's like I'm putting A flat minor on top of G7 for the second chord, and then it's like I'm putting A melodic minor on top of C major 7 for the third chord. So yeah, it is very much that way. And also, if you think about the upper structure chords, upper structure voicings that we talked about in Jazz Piano Holiday, then that's all kind of some of the same stuff. And so, for instance, like one of the voicings that I used was over G7. an A flat minor chord, the flat 2 minor chord. And it comes directly from this sound. Now, you don't have to know that whole scale or know that that scale exists to use the upper structure voicings. I talked about the upper structure voicings just by showing you, hey, these work. We didn't have to talk about, where they came from, but you could tell they worked without knowing the scale because, well, this is a triad, and hey, that is a flat 9, which we knew was a good note. That's a third, which we know is a good note, and that's a flat 13, which we know is a good note because those are both borrowed from C minor. So these upper structure voicings you can learn and use without dealing with all these different scales, but they do come from these scales, and as do some of the ones that I didn't put on the list because they're really exotic sounding. But I think I did put that one on the list. I think I did put E major over C. If I didn't, I hedged and thought about it, but then didn't. So yeah, there's these are some sounds that you can use. And so now when I talk about that, this isn't limited to jazz improvisation. This is where I do want to actually take a quick look at whatever the most recent thing is that I see that I think is going to work from the community, and just talk about how you can bring these in to a piece that really was conceived without all of that, but bring some of those scales in, as you have to know all the scales in order to pull this off. And while that loads, I get a drink of water. Man, seriously? Yeah, I know my system is often. So I'm going to skip Sam's piece because Sam's piece is probably modal in other ways that we can talk about next time. I want to look at, I'm going to look at Steiner's Flip, Flop, and Fly because it's so obviously, if you know the song, not this language at all. But I'm going to just grab an excerpt from, because this is Steiner's, the same person who did that other song that we looked at last week, I Only Want to Be With You, his arrangement of that. So let me just play a little bit of this here. Yeah, it's got to be one of those. So yeah, this is going to be perfect because it's totally not that language, right? It's really triads and simple seventh chords. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that one spot where we had the F chord leading in to one of the sections right here. Let's check this out. So instead of playing that sound, just an F triad, I could use that altered scale, that diminished whole tone scale, half whole, whole, whole. So starting on F, half whole, then whole. That's my set of notes. I could use that in the voicing. So instead of just voicing this as a plain F triad, I could use all of those notes. And get this really crunchy sound, right? And you can spread the notes out however you want in your voicing. I like that one. I like that one a lot. So that was just those same notes turned into a voicing. So it's yeah, and you definitely want to do it in conjunction with how it fits in its context. The reason I picked this F chord is it's the 5 chord. The 5 chord is the place where we expect tension. That's what it's there for. So by using that sound right there, there's some reasonable chance that it's going to work. Now, do I use it everywhere there's a 5 chord? No. But if you want there to be a 5 chord that you want to sound extra crunchy, you do it there. Maybe in the first part here, we use the Lydian Dominant sound. because this is dominant seventh, right? It's got A flats, right? Right, that's what's going on here. What if I made that Lydian dominant? So, because this is basically Mixolydian right now. That's the typical kind of blues sound. It's major, but with flat seven, because our one chord in a blues is typically a dominant seventh chord. So we flat the seventh, which is essentially Mixolydian. So what if I, though, made it Lydian dominant, change those E's to E naturals? I can do that. It just makes it sound different, makes it sound a bit more exotic. So there I'm actually doing it in the melody there. And as long as I'm at it, maybe instead of that, maybe I do that to make it Lydian-ier. And maybe I don't go to that A, because that A now sounds so trite coming after all that other stuff. Maybe I go to an A flat, because that's part of that scale. Oh, except we just came from the A flat. So I'll go to an F sharp instead, G flat. So. Actually, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. So I can totally do that. Yes, so these are sounds that you can incorporate. Now, I'm not saying that would have been a good idea on this song, because this song really does have such a sense of simplicity to it. But if you're dealing with a sound that a piece that's at all more harmonically complex than this, then bringing in some of these scales, some of these sounds into particular places could absolutely turn out to be worthwhile. So in order to really apply that, you need the full list of things. But in the community, I did post a link to the section in my jazz improvisation primer, the section on different scales there. And if you read through that, you'll see all the different scales, the modes of the melodic minor, as well as the modes of major, as well as that diminished scale, as well as the whole tone scale. I'm pretty sure I talk about all those. And I talk about how they're used. And again, it doesn't have to be jazz, it doesn't have to be rock. So I could also take some random more classicals, and I want to find one that's a known bit of clear classical. Oh, Frank's G minor string quintet. So yeah, this is going to be totally classical in its conception. And I'm going to, this is based on kind of the Pachelbel canon in D. It's not like a regular canon. It's that very specific type of canon in which you have a repeated harmonic progression. And I'm going to start just in the middle here where it's going on and change one of the melodies to do the thing that I want it to do. Where am I going to do it? I'm going to do it where the eighth notes start. Right here. So let's listen to this part right here. So right there, we have G minor, and then B flat. By the way, could people hear that when I played my left hand here, I'm simplifying what I'm reading here because I'm trying to play just what I want, that there are parallel fifths there. So that's there in his accompaniment, but that's just accompaniment. The real business is what's going on up here. But and anytime you play root position triads one after another, it's gonna have parallel fifths. And pianists are writing for piano, we often are okay with that. So right here, this is a dominant seventh chord. and then another dominant 7th chord. And this one has E flat because we're in a minor key. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to George Russellify that little passage there. So it'll still be this. And now, this already is part of that Russell scale, but I want to use more of the scale. So let me play that. All I did was used that very altered scale there, that half whole, whole, whole over the F7, and then I used it again. Oops. Should have been a B flat on that one. So that's what I did. So I'm just decorating this melody a little bit more, but using the notes of that scale. So even though this is coming from a very, early Baroque Pachelbel we're talking about here, is where this is coming from in terms of stylistically what's going on. To some extent, you can incorporate those sounds. I mean, yeah, it's not going to sound like Pachelbel, but if the goal isn't to sound early Baroque, but just to sound like it's good music, what I'm saying is it doesn't have to be jazz to use these sounds. I can totally use these sounds. I just like that line. It's interesting. That's good music, right? So it was good music the way Frank had it too. But I want to point out that those sounds are at your disposal no matter what kind of music you're writing. If you want to, just, I don't know, get a little more harmonic color happening, you can do these things. So, yeah, interesting. Charles Ives. Yeah, I could totally hear that because, again, when you mentioned, Dean, the bitonality that it kind of implies, that's a Charles Ives thing. And so that's really what's happening, as is this part of the scale. That descending part there is a whole tone scale. Well, that also should remind you of Debussy because he loved whole tone scales. But maybe stylistically I didn't feel Debussy-ish just because how metronomic I was playing and everything. Okay, well, in any case, that's what I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you how these scales work. So again, there's tons of the scales. My goal wasn't to teach you every single one of them and how to use them. Now better? So sorry about that, and but I was just wrapping up. I just wanted to be able to conclude by saying, hopefully you can find ways of using these, and eventually, hopefully, I'll come up with a course to teach more of this kind of stuff in detail. So I definitely hope you've enjoyed this and found ways of exploring it in more detail. So that said, I do want to sign off now and get on with other matters. So. Come on, minus 50. There we go. And then play my theme music. Music, and even if you can't hear the theme music, it doesn't really matter, right? But headphones, so I can hear my own theme music. There we go. Ha, I'm getting a little better about that much anyhow. So thanks everyone for being here. Hope you enjoyed the session. Remember, tomorrow, same time, I am going to do a special session just on film music and that whole synchronization stuff. Since I had so many issues with it yesterday, I'm going to try again tomorrow and think I got it figured out. So come to the community and you'll see a little pop-up that says, hey, Marc's live, and join me there. So hope to see you, and have a good day, good week, and see you soon.